And joining us at the roundtable this week is Bill Howland, director of the Lake Champlain Basin Program, a nonprofit that works with communities and groups in New York, Vermont, and Quebec to protect Lake Champlain and its surrounding watersheds. Welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Every 3 years or so, you put out a State of the Lake. It's an in-depth analysis of the health of Lake Champlain and the watersheds that surround it. And you basically do a report card on how the lake is doing, its water quality, and some of the environmental issues facing it. The 2015 report is out, and the overwhelming majority of the lake is in good or excellent shape.
That's right.
There are a couple of trouble spots, though, that are notorious, and that seems to be still one of the big issues for the lake.
That's correct. Those spots are the Missisquoi Bay and St. Albans Bay in particular. Also, we have some challenges in the southern part of the lake. In Missisquoi Bay, when there is an algae bloom, it's a pretty alarming situation there. Also in St. Albans Bay, for each year of the past many years, probably 10, 12 years, there's been a significant algae and an aquatic plant collection that accumulations that bother people a great deal. So those two areas generate a lot of well-justified and merited concern. But overall, the condition of Lake Champlain, most of it by far, is in really quite good shape. And so it's important for people to know that.
Which is important because a number of communities get their drinking water from Lake Champlain. So overall, that is good news. Their drinking water is in pretty good shape.
For most people, yes, indeed. About 150,000 people in the watershed drink water that came from the lake, and almost all of it would have been treated moderately by a water treatment facility, and the water is very good, it should be. There's probably another 50,000 or so who drink water directly from the lake, especially in seasonal camps and summer residences. And while we don't recommend that, that is a very real population of users of lake water as well. And they do take a few chances with problems, but for the most part, they do pretty well.
You mentioned during the summer months in particular, blue-green algae blooms are a problem and have been for several years now. It seems to be getting a little bit worse depending on the year as we go along. And you mentioned the two areas, St. Albans Bay and Missisquoi Bay in particular. Blue-green algae in itself is not harmful, but there are different varieties that can be toxic and that can make people sick. It can kill pets, so there is obviously a health concern about blue-green algae.
That's true, and blue-green algae have always been in the lake in some degree. It's important for them to be there, and yet when there's too much nutrient concentration in the water, the algae grow prolifically, and they can, especially we believe with phosphorus concentrations being high in the lake due to the runoff from the landscape. The blue-green algae does very well, and in some circumstances, as you mentioned, the algae can produce a toxin. We think that that's associated with possibly with the presence of more nitrogen than we had realized in the past. So we're going to continue to be concerned about nutrients, but probably you'll hear more about our concerns about nitrogen, because they may be, they are implicated, they may be responsible for the transition to a toxic algae bloom. Blue-green algae by itself is pretty ugly stuff when it's concentrated, but it may be harmless. So the best advice we give people in choosing whether to go in the water or play in the water or splash in the water, let their dogs or others, people go in the water, is if it looks scummy, don't go in it. That's a pretty safe, good guideline.
We've seen in the past couple of weeks, Burlington shut down the beaches for a couple of days after some blue-green algae blooms were spotted. A number of communities now and water systems are going to test beginning this year for blue-green algae in their water supplies to see if they detect it. So steps are taken both
right.
by the beaches, the communities, and also the water districts to check for it.
That's true, and the algae blooms can occur anywhere in the lake. Usually it's in a shallow area near shore, and in a bad year it can be pretty much any part of the lake. It's just the main lake, the Broad Lake, sees very few. Or if they do show up in the Broad Lake or in Mallett's Bay, for example, they usually are not very persistent. They break up and they don't last for very long. Unfortunately, in Missisquoi Bay and in St. Albans Bay, they tend to hang around when they occur. We also notice this is really not just happening in Lake Champlain. We don't have all the answers as to what drives blue-green algae blooms. I wish we did. But in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, throughout the Great Lakes, and in fact, many of the large lakes of the continent and across the world even, there are more blue-green algae blooms happening in recent years than ever before. So it's not just nutrients, it's not just water temperature, although that's implicated as well. There's some other factors playing, and we need to study what drives these blooms a little more before we have the kinds of answers we'd want to have.
You mentioned water temperature. That is a factor. Many people believe the water temperature on Lake Champlain over the past 50 years has gone up. And to some people, 6.5 degrees may not sound like a lot, but to scientists and environmentalists, that's a pretty dramatic increase.
That's a surface temperature increase in the month of August since 1964, is the one that you mentioned, and that's in part of the lake. That's a big change, and in terms of what the ecosystem response is, it will be quite significant. The air temperature in the region has increased by a little less than 3 degrees in the last 50, 60 years, 70 years. And the projections are it will increase a little more, but surface water temperature has increased more. And this is troubling. This is really troubling. And it doesn't just reflect climate change alone, although that's certainly part of it. The air temperatures are warmer, there's a lot of sunshine and so forth. But as the forest and the riverbanks throughout the drainage system have been removed, sometimes clearing right to the edge of the river for farming purposes in particular, the streams are less shaded than they were. And as a result, they're warmer than they have been in the past. And so a lot of moving parts. The net result is the lake gets warmer in the summer than we're used to when we're seeing some of the changes.
And that can have a number of effects, as you mentioned, that can promote more plant growth, more blue-green algae growth. It can affect life in the lake. Overall, the bigger picture, I know there's concern beyond Lake Champlain, obviously, about rising temperatures and the possibility of that causing more severe weather and seeing more severe storms, bigger rainfalls, which can be problematic in a number of ways.
Exactly right. In the tropical latitudes, there's a lot more solar energy being absorbed by the oceans. There's a lot more evaporation of moisture from the ocean. A warm ocean gives up a lot of moisture to the atmosphere, and that actually, when it rises in the atmosphere over the equatorial regions, it cools. It's pushed to the north and south. We're concerned with the northern flow, and it brings moisture and energy. All that energy it took to evaporate is still held in that air mass, and when it precipitates into rain over more northerly regions like our own, there's a great deal of energy released, and that's what makes the winds more fierce and the rain sometimes more intense. And we're seeing that even though it's not always in the form of a warming, we might have a bitter cold outbreak in the middle of winter. It's all being driven by the solar ocean and continental kind of relationship that it's highly energized because of global climate change.
And we've seen in 2011, probably the most recent year, where we really saw the effects. In the spring, there was the flooding, a record flooding on Lake Champlain. Then, of course, we had Tropical Storm Irene, Tropical Storm Lee. We felt the impacts of that both in New York and Vermont. And so that was a year where we really saw significant weather impact on Lake Champlain.
We did, and that rainwater and those flooding events released and eroded a lot of sediment and a lot of the nutrients that were attached to the sediments. And so we saw a big spike in 2011, concentrations of nutrients in the waters of Lake Champlain, and the State of the Lake report shows that. It also shows something we weren't sure we were going to see, which is in the years following 2011, the floods, there seems to be a relaxation or a return to the average. So we didn't know how long it would take for those in-lake concentrations that were so high in 2011 to
go back
down to the average. It seems like a couple of years. We have seen, in 3 years, we've seen it return to not good enough at all, but at least it's not so dramatic. But their fluctuations are still pretty big.
You mentioned the nutrients in particular, phosphorus, which we have known for a number of years, nitrogen, maybe more of a concern about that in recent years. Together, are the majority of the nutrients coming from farms? And
well, in a practical sense, the answer is yes. There's a great deal that comes from the forested areas, but there's far more forested acreage in the watershed. So on an acre by acre basis, not much comes from forestry. There's also quite a lot that comes from urban areas on an acre by acre basis. That could be more than farms, but there aren't very many acres of urban region. When you look at the land use of farming, it is really a major contributor. Direct runoff from farms, which we would call wash off or something like that, is on the order of 40% of the phosphorus load going into Lake Champlain. And then there's another category called stream bank collapse, or that a lot of that happens at the edge of agricultural fields. And so while it's not running off the farmlands directly, it's the collapse of the stream banks that have been farmed for decades or maybe centuries. So that really is in the agricultural basket as well. And all told, it's certainly easily half of the problem is from farmlands. And so we know where we have to look to find solutions. It's in every direction. It's in urban, it's in forested areas, it's in our own backyards, but we also realize we have to have some major changes in the agricultural performance with regard to water quality, or we are not going to make headway.
For a number of years, you've been working with farmers on buffer zones, on handling their manure better so less gets into the water, and taking a number of steps. But Vermont now has passed a new law just this past session that seems to maybe take a few additional steps, hiring new state workers within the DEC and the Ag Department to maybe go out and work with farms, smaller farms, to try to maybe help them come up with better practices and at the same time maybe better enforcement.
Yeah, both of those are going to be important. Agricultural best management practices are going to be, under that law, new law in Vermont, they're going to be re-examined and made, we hope, much more effective. And they will, instead of being accepted agricultural practices, they're going to become what's called required agricultural practices. And they will be practices that are required of all farms, not just large farms and medium farms. Small farms individually may not contribute much, but there are many, many more small farms than large farms, and many farms keep their size within the limits of whichever category they want to be, small farm, medium farm, or large farm. And small farms are very, very, very little regulated compared to the larger ones. So there's going to be some significant changes. There also will need to be some attention paid to the way in which we farm, and farmers need new options that might move a little bit away from the recent tradition of large dairy operations that rely on a great deal of corn. Corn that is cultivated in the lowlands that flood seasonally. It's not a sustainable model of agriculture in its present form. And so we're hoping that there can be research and exploration of other choices farmers can have to farm that will really reduce their impact and increase the sustainable use of the soils that I'm sure they value, and we hope this can happen.
We've seen some farmers taking steps on their own. One farmer in particular up near Missisquoi Bay using new equipment that will take the manure and bury it in the ground as they go, so that reduces the amount of runoff. Of course, that's costly, and the machine that he has, you need to pipe it to the equipment to bury it right into the farm field. So yes, it's not ideal.
It's a good example of an innovation that not a lot of people have thought about 10 years ago. It's manure injection right into the soil. And sometimes some farms now are pumping manure from their manure pits in a long fire hose-like hose that is attached to the tractor, pulling that injector right across, or even spraying if they do spray. But rather than running trucks back and forth, which costs a lot of diesel and it compacts the soil a great deal, there are many innovations. We have to make sure that each of these innovations we encourage. The Natural Resource Conservation Service does provide a lot of assistance for farms that want to change, to upgrade and improve their techniques. And we also know that it's going to take more than fine-tuning. Some agricultural operations are simply located in areas that are not suited to agricultural operations from the perspective of water quality, even though the corn may grow very well. If it's in a field that floods every year after it's been planted, it's just not a sustainable use. And so there's some hard answers that are going to have to be built, and we're going to have to figure out how to make the best path we can towards significant reductions in phosphorus from the landscape.
Is it getting to the point where the state will take steps telling farmers they have to take certain land out of operation, out of agricultural use?
Well, I don't know of any movement in that direction, really, and so I don't foresee that in very many cases. On the other hand, the problems are not going to go away unless we do something really profoundly different. And as urban areas are going to have to spend a substantial amount of money to upgrade their wastewater treatment plants to make a very small amount of difference, important though it is, it's a small amount of difference, and they're going to be digging down quite deep in their pockets to pay for that. It will be harder for that large urban populace to see agricultural operations importing railroad cars full of phosphorus from outside the basin, hundreds of thousands of pounds of phosphorus, hundreds of tons, maybe even going on to 1 or 2 farms. So when you see that there are these movements of nutrients in the system, there are some areas where there's a real cost-effective way to control inputs of phosphorus. And wastewater treatment plants upgrades may be important, but they usually, I would say, and most people do, that's not the most effective bang for the buck, when at the same time we're importing a great deal of phosphorus fertilizer into the basin willy-nilly in the consumer world, and deliberately and systematically in the agricultural sector, we need to take a very close look at that. This last legislature declined to tax any agricultural fertilizer, though they did put a small tax on consumer fertilizer. It seems like an opportunity lost.
And are farmers getting better and working with the state on really testing to see what level of nutrients they need for their farm field so that they're not putting excess amounts on?
I think a lot of farmers are trying very hard. I know many individual cases where the farmers are really very interested in reducing their impact on water quality.
Because it saves them money if they're not putting too much on.
It saves them money, and there is the understanding is getting out there that saving your soil from being eroded is a really important thing. And as soil sustainability becomes more and more a priority in the agricultural sector, water quality from those farms will be improved.
You mentioned wastewater treatment plants, sewage treatment plants. A number of people will always point to them, especially after a big rain, after a big storm, that they're overwhelmed, and so an amount of raw sewage will end up going into the tributaries or going into the lake. So is that a major concern and a major problem?
I think that it is a really significant problem when we have storm sewers and the waste sewers, sewage sewers combined and going through the wastewater treatment plants. The problem that you mentioned is that when we have 2 inches of rain in an hour and a half, the storm sewers are overwhelmed. They flow into the wastewater treatment plant, overwhelm that, and everything rushes out into the lake. There's really no excuse for that. Of course, it's expensive infrastructure to change, but that's so preventable that we need to stop saying that it's too expensive to fix. It's really not. But it does go to show that every effort to have a rain garden or a rain barrel or anything that can be done that slows down the runoff in an urban area so that it lingers on the landscape a little longer or goes into the ground but not into the ditch. It will reduce the amount of stormwater runoff that hits that combined sewer system. If it's combined, that makes a world of difference. And so everybody can do something to just slow down that runoff and keep it in the landscape a little longer. That's really important.
We just heard this week Senator Kirsten Gillibrand was in the North Country talking about microbeads that are in many of our healthcare products now, our toothpaste and other healthcare products that are finding their way into water systems, into our watersheds. And she was talking about how a number of sewage treatment plants, a large percentage, maybe 3/4 of the sewage treatment plants, aren't set up to be able to filter these out. And that even a couple here in the North Country that were looked at have seen that be the case. We also have researchers talking about they're now seeing the microbeads and tiny bits of plastic showing up in our watersheds and in Lake Champlain. This is relatively new and now just getting on people's radar.
It is. I'm really glad that the Senator Gillibrand has focused on it, and I know that the legislation she's sponsoring, and I think that Senator Leahy in Vermont is a co-sponsor now. I really think that's a vitally important initiative, because using tiny beads of plastic in so many personal care products makes the product work okay, but dentists are now finding plastic beads up under the gums of their patients where they can cause inflammations and problems. And that's just the health side of it, that aspect of the health side. In the waste stream, when these things are flushed down the drains, after a shower, wherever they go, they're in the flow of all of the waste that goes through the sewage system. There are toxins in that waste. There's all kinds of things, and the tiny particles have a huge surface area for their weight, and they're plastic. It's like plastic that generates static cling. A lot of these microparticles microbeads will collecting and scavenging from the waste stream a lot of toxic materials that are in there. Those materials will attach to the microbead, and the microbead making it through the filter goes out into the water body, where the plankton may consume it, zooplankton, and it may then enter the food chain and be concentrated in perch. So they're taking the entrails out of yellow perch or other fish and finding microbeads that came down the pipe. This is not good, especially because the toxins that they carry with them, that they scavenged out of the waste stream, can then be concentrated by the fish or by the lower animals, the plankton, the floating little critters, the bugs. They get bioaccumulated up the food chain. We just don't need that. And so every plastic microbead is kind of an ambassador for the world of toxins to get them into the fish that we or the osprey or whatever is going to eat up toward the top of the food chain. This problem is not a critical problem right now, but we can see for sure it will be. And so that's why it's really gratifying to see a congressional effort to prevent the inclusion of microbeads in our healthcare products now, and not wait until we have a critical problem with PCB contamination in fish or something like that. That would come. We can see it would come.
Senator Gillibrand sponsoring a bill, a bipartisan bill, that would ban these microbeads from products, healthcare products, by 2018. Scientists are now studying this, but is it so new that they really don't have a good indication or idea yet how far it's going up the food chain?
I think they're getting an indication now, and it's not at a crisis stage at all right now, but it is absolutely clearly moving in a direction that is really bad, and so it's also easily replaced with other small granules of material, whether they're organic crushed shells from nuts or whatever, or even fine sand. It's inert. It doesn't have that plastic surface that to which so many toxins would be so inclined to absorb. And so this is an easy replacement in the product line. And a lot of manufacturers, I think, are already figuring, oh, holy smokes, we don't need to go here any farther.
Because for many years they made the products without them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's a relatively recent innovation, I think in the last maybe 8 or 10 years.
We talked a little bit about some of the challenges that the lake has had for a number of years, the nutrients, the phosphorus. Some of the new challenges facing the lake since the last report in 2012. What are some of the new issues confronting the lake? Well,
there are two that come to mind right away. One of them is aquatic invasive species. It's an old issue, but with new faces and new invaders. So spiny water flea has invaded. The Asian clam is now established in Lake George, not in Lake Champlain yet. We're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop there.
The Lachute River is the
That's
connection.
Right, they're connected. And so this is every single time an invasive species arrives and establishes itself, it means we lost the battle that we have to fight outside the basin, outside the watershed, to keep them from getting here. And every time they're going to displace in some new way. They'll displace a native species or perhaps even displace an invasive species. The quagga mussel, which is kind of like the evil twin of the zebra mussel, because it's more aggressive, it can colonize deeper. It actually, if it arrives, you probably will wipe out a lot of zebra mussels by outcompeting them for the substrate that they now occupy. But it's not better. They're very similar. And the quagga mussel can colonize deeper, faster, and so we just don't need this. And I hope that the State of the Lake report reinforces the need to clean and to wash it, clean and rinse and dry boats and fishing gear, and make sure that when boat trailers have had the weeds plucked off. I have to do it myself. You know, everybody does. Should do it. Pull all of the aquatic all of the aquatic plants off the bottom of your boat trailer before you go to another water body, and those are continuing concerns. And then in addition, the State of the Lake report this year shows a few things that we've not put in the past. One of them is the frequency of freezing across shore to shore of Lake Champlain, which has decreased a great deal. It used to freeze across frequently, much more frequently than it does now. And that's likely a matter of the changing climates and the softer winters that we get these in recent years, and the phosphorus concentrations is an old story, but there's always a new twist. There are some changes in the Missisquoi River, in Otter Creek, that, for example, that show a reduction in the amount of phosphorus they're bringing into the lake, but the lake concentrations have not yet reflected that. So there's some good news in a way. I mean, if you are trying to reduce the concentration of phosphorus in the lake, start by the inputs, and if they have been increasing in their load of phosphorus, the first thing you have to hope for and try for and really work on is change the sign of the angle, change from getting worse to getting better, and then hang on to it. Then it will work out if we can just make that change. So we have turned the corner in a few of the tributaries. A few other tributaries getting a little worse. So it is the first time we have been able to report tributary improvements. In the Broad Lake, even though I have said, and it's true, that the Broad Lake is in beautiful condition, the trend is all in good numbers, but the trend is not a good trend. It is increasing. It's still almost nutrient poor. It's mesotrophic in the words of an ecologist. Oligotrophic is nutrient poor. Mesotrophic is sort of in the middle, and eutrophic is nutrient rich. And this is in the mesotrophic, in the lower end of the mesotrophic, or the middle status. And that's great, but the trend is not good. And the Broad Lake is huge. And the main lake, being huge, it's kind of like trying to change the direction of the aircraft carrier, you know, by pushing on it a little, and we have to do something better than that. So even though it's in wonderful shape, the main lake, I'm worried for it. I'm really very concerned that the trend has to change. I want to see a decrease in concentrations in the main lake for several years in a row, and then we can breathe a sigh of relief that we're doing what we need to do right.
Is the best way to tackle that still the non-point source of phosphorus and nutrients getting in from the farmland and the forest and the urban runoff?
I think it is the best way. We also have to recognize that the wastewater treatment plants, there are wastewater treatment plants that discharge out into the Broad Lake. Burlington Bay is in quite nice shape. The city of Burlington discharges out beyond the bay, out several miles out into the lake, into the main lake. And that's just to point at the situation with Burlington. Several other communities do have point source discharges. They all need to be doing their best. But overall, it's the landscape that needs attention from every backyard, every farmer, every landowner, every highway crew working on ditches, every new construction job, every golf course. We're all in this, and it is not going to be, you know, my greatest fear is that we're going to assemble that huge amount of money that somebody says we need in a given year, like 50, 60, $80 million, and that the public is going to say, okay, that's our tax money. Now go buy us a clean lake. Go down to one of the big box stores. Spend that really well. Buy us a clean lake. It's not going to happen that way. It's not going to happen. All the money in the world won't clean Lake Champlain if people in the basin are not really engaged in trying to make sure that their impact on the lake is minimized.
You mentioned the large infusion of cash. Developers who want to put a power line under Lake Champlain, run it along the bottom of Lake Champlain, they've won approval to do one on the New York side to run power from Quebec to New York City. They've won their state and federal permits. They're seeking similar permits to run one closer to the Vermont side and cut over through Vermont to supply New England. They've promised nearly $300 million in money for lake restoration and cleanup projects and such, as a way of saying thank you for letting them use the lake to run their power cable. When you start talking about amounts of money like that, could that be put to good use and programs that could make a significant difference?
It could make an enormous difference. It's an astonishingly large number for a goodwill gesture, and I think the big question will be how those funds are spent, and on what, and if they're feel good projects. Feel good and look good projects aren't really going to get this done necessarily. There's some real serious needs that have to be met that could use those funds effectively. So I hope that works well. There's another aspect of this, in that the impact statements, the impact assessments of the power lines are being viewed pretty independently of each other. I don't think the cumulative effect of many power lines has been necessarily assessed, but I'm not opposed to them at all. I'm just saying that I want to make sure that that the impacts are fully assessed. And so yes, that money certainly could make an enormous difference. I hope that it's channeled in such a way that it's very effective in the way it's used.
We're talking about invasive species. You mentioned there are several more knocking at the door potentially. New York State is taking steps now, looking at Lake George and what Lake George has done as a model with lake stewardship and having inspectors look at the boats, have boat washing stations. They're expanding that into other parts of the Adirondacks now, and to try to reach more boat owners going to other lakes and rivers in the Adirondacks. One area that has always been looked at is the Champlain Canal, and a number of people raised the red flags and sounded the alarm over the spiny water flea years ago that it was dangerously close to the Champlain Canal, which flows right into the southern end of Lake Champlain. Does more focus have to be put on that canal and more attention paid to that, or do you see other invasive species coming from the Great Lakes and Erie Canal and Hudson River coming right up the Champlain Canal and using that as the gateway to Lake Champlain?
Well, both are good observations. It is a vector, to be sure, and although it has taken a long time, we believe the New York State Canal Corporation and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are now signing an agreement. I think all the lights are green now for them to have an agreement for the Army Corps to conduct a feasibility study on a barrier, and that would be a physical, like a dry land barrier, to the movement of invasive species, not to the movement of boats. So some way or another, boats will have to be passing up that canal. And there's some really wonderful, exciting engineering opportunities to make this an attraction rather than an obstacle. And I think that's what we're hoping for. And we are actually helping to pay for some of that feasibility study with funds that were really directed our way by Senator Patrick Leahy. And so we are really looking forward to that project. And now the effectiveness of a barrier, we are assuming would be very, very high, and it would remove the canal from the world of vectors. There is right now a stream that feeds the canal. It's called the feeder canal, that feeds the Champlain Canal water, and when it's not loading the locks, it has been running directly into Lake Champlain, and it comes from the Hudson system, the Hudson River system. And the Canal Corps has done some engineering to figure out how to redirect the excess flow that comes from the Hudson River system back into the Hudson River and system and not have it run down into Lake Champlain. That's a very big and important step. I think things will be getting better in the story of the Champlain Canal system. I know that it has been a glacially slow process. Well, we've all been frustrated, but I think it is picking up speed, and to the credit of the Canal Corporation and its trustees, the New York State Thruway Authority, they are moving. And so in the meantime, the Canal Corps has also developed a boat launch steward program to help people clean their boats and so forth. And so there are some good faith movements there. I would love to see no further arrivals, and I hope that whatever barrier is found feasible is put in place quickly enough so that we see that there are no more bad actors coming through.
I know, particularly on the New York side, there is growing concern over the oil trains that are moving millions of gallons of crude oil daily, literally millions of gallons of crude oil, several trains a day, from Canada, from the Canadian border down through Rouse's Point and Plattsburgh along Lake Champlain on their way to the Port of Albany. In the past couple of years, the amount of oil being moved by rail has increased dramatically. And while the railroad and the industry will point to its safety record, saying that it has a great safety record, there are obviously concerns that there could be derailments. We saw the one 2 years ago in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, disasters that killed 47 people. In recent months, there have been others in other parts of the United States. Many of the concerns are for Lake Champlain, that if there were a derailment, that could be an ecological nightmare for Lake Champlain to have that crude oil going into the lake. And there's talk of carrying more crude oil, the dirtier tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, in the coming months and years ahead, and dramatically increasing the amount being moved in the months ahead. But for many people, they see that as a threat to the lake.
It's a huge threat. We have mentioned that in the State of Lake report. The rail cars that are used to carry the oils down the tracks that go right on the edge of the lake are really not well suited for that purpose, and especially the variety of oil that is being shipped now. As you mentioned, it's more explosive. And the tragedy at Lake Mégantic, over 40 people died. The entire center of the town not only was destroyed and burned, blown up, but it can't be settled or populated because it's toxic. The soil's not suitable to have people in the area. So there are environmental concerns for a spill into Lake Champlain, and there are all of the human health risks that you would see from a fire and the ecosystem impacts on the land. And much of that rail line, as it passes down the shore of Lake Champlain, is not accessible to highways. The way to fight a fire would be to send another train down as far as you could until it got to where the tracks are destroyed or too close, or to go in with aircraft or marine firefighting units. And we just don't have that in our marine firefighting units. Are very, very limited. They're designed to put out fire in a boat or maybe a summer camp. And so we also do not have the kind of cross-boundary agreements between New York, Vermont, and Quebec and the U.S. federal agencies involved and the railroad themselves to have adequate booms and sorbent materials to deal with a spill, a major spill. So we are at real risk, and that's something that's changed, as you noted. It's changed dramatically in the last 5 years, the frequency of and the quantity of oil, much of it highly volatile. So it's a real concern. I think the I would like to see some of those difficult decisions made that amount to limiting the frequency of those trains, limiting the number of cars, the 25 or 30, whatever it should be, but not 100. Because as car after car after car goes across any particular section of track, the track is depressed again and again and again. It's kind of like hitting it with a hammer downward, and it takes a little while to rebound a little after a train is gone. You can see this happen. And to add car after car so the trains are 4 times as long as what the tracks were really able to handle is just fraught with hazard. So that's the short term, and in the longer term we really need to see the double-hulled tanks that are so slow to have built. They're on back order for probably a decade or something. The capacity to put them together is not very high because nobody's paying enough attention, nobody's incentivized it enough to make it happen. We have to, whether it's pollution from phosphorus or potential pollution from oil or microbeads or invasive species, you know, our management as a society has always been to turn the dials a little bit in such a way that doesn't cause anybody to be too worked up. And politically, there's a disincentive, unfortunately, to making waves and to upsetting people. And the job requires some really unpopular, with some people, some really important, decisive leadership, and it will make some people really howl. And unless we are willing to do that, we have political figures who are willing to take important and strong stands, we're really fine-tuning instead of making major changes. So that's what I was very happy to see Senator Gillibrand's initiative today on microbeads, to get out there in front with leadership before we have a crisis. That's what we need, and we need 100 places.
Bill Howland, thank you very much for taking the time to come visit with us. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.